Peter, can you advance the slides yourself? You have
Yes, I
that,
can.
and we can hear you. Okay, fantastic. Peter, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chad. Thanks to the organizers. I just wanted to say I am really sorry that I can't be there in person. I've recently developed hopefully some temporary spine conditions that restrict my mobility a lot. So I apologize for coming to you via video. I was told that this was supposed to be a retrospective on IO and marketing. I think somehow the marketing got deleted, but that's all right because IO is a subfield of marketing anyway. So what I want to do today, and I'm trying to get this, yes, is to talk really focus more on the marketing literature and what it contributes to our understandings. And I wanted to be even more specific than that and organize my thoughts into four major areas of research or topical areas of interest, I think, to everyone here. Value of experimentation and randomized variation, advertising, which certainly plays an important role in all of the industries I think we care about, or at least most of them. Search models, which are related, of course, to advertising, as they can be thought of in some ways as a mechanism by which advertising works, and a little bit about heterogeneity, not too much. And interesting enough, I do have a few responses to some of the things that Ariel said earlier today about switching costs. So that may tie together a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm not doing a survey by any stretch of the imagination. I'm going to point out some papers that I think are pretty interesting, and some of them are a point counterpoint. So they're actually presenting conflicting views on the same subject, the same issue, and I also want to add a few thoughts of my own. So that's what I want to do. So let me proceed to experimentation, or more generally, randomized variation. And here I do not have in mind this sort of estimation of a system of demand and supply, like Steve was just talking about, but the sort of traditional microeconometrics, single equation, use of instruments in order to make some kind of causal identification of a causal effect. I think it's fair to say this is a somewhat strong statement, but that this literature, which it's quite vast, um, where you make a sort of a clever choice of an instrument and you proceed with inference conditional on assuming that that instrument is valid. Um, and I think that that time has kind of passed us a little bit in the sense that a lot of these instruments are obviously not valid. Particularly a number of them been used in the empirical literature that I'm aware of in marketing. And if you add, there's been, I think, some progress, and I think we'll hear about this more in the upcoming panel. But to moving towards the notion of plausibly exogenous instruments, meaning that things that are strictly do violate the exclusion restriction, but do so in somewhat of a mild manner, namely their direct effect is less than their indirect effect. But if you add many weak instruments to questionable validity, then I think you start to destroy the value of inference. So all that's a way of saying is that inference based on true random variation in causal inference is always welcome, right? So there's sort of two ways that people try to purify these estimates, right? One is they say, let's try to find some instrument which we think has purely exogenous variation. Or the other way to do it is to say, let's control for as many things we can and hope that what's left over, or what's left in X after we take out all the effects of that, is actually plausibly exogenous, right? And there's some interesting recent marketing paper published by Gordon et al. And what they did is they went to randomized experimentations and advertising on Facebook. So Facebook has built a platform that allows you to do randomized experimentation at reasonably low cost. We could argue about there are some problems in the way they've implemented that. I'm not going to get into that. But what Gordon et al. Did is they compared the estimates of the effective exposures to ads from the pure random variation, the random assignment in these fairly large-scale randomized experiments to what you would get if you analyze the same ads using passively observed data. And the methods they use there are primarily what I would call control variate methods. The old idea, you put in a lot of X's and functions of X's and so on, and now we have machine learning to do that for us in a variety of different ways. So in particular, they looked at propensity scores, which is, of course, just, one way of doing that, and the so-called double machine learning. But if you read the double machine learning paper, there is a heroic assumption that essentially after you're done controlling for these unspecified functions, possibly multivariate functions, that what's left over is as though it were random. And they find that it doesn't recover the effects from the randomized experiments very much at all. And in particular, as we've often found, they overestimate the effects. So I would conclude that I think essentially instrumental variable methods as practiced in a certain literature, single equation literature, and these elaborate control methods that are now more feasible don't work very well. I think that puts a higher premium on true randomized variation. But in the marketing context, I think it's even worse, namely that the ability, for example, to customize and target ads to individual consumers based on their own preference data, right? So their own preferences data, whether that's from browsing data, past purchases, what have you, makes that selection on unobservables problem, I think, even more acute. And you can also see this is not really practiced as much as you might think its value would be, but there is some interest in customization of prices when I say customization to the individual consumer. So all that, I think, leads you to the conclusion that the value of random variation is higher today than it ever was. Okay. But I do think that obviously there's limitations on the value of pure random variation and nothing else. And I just want to make just a couple points here so that when I think about when you think about field experiments that are done for social policy evaluation, where you're thinking about some policy that you're instituting uniformly across all firms in the industry, right? Of the kind of policy evaluation that the IO field is just famous for. That actually that may be more straightforward in a field experimental context than it is for firm policy. And let me give an example. It's not an example that I've actually done work on, but it's an example that I think that receives a lot of interest in the press recently is consumption of social media, right? So there's a number of people arguing in a variety of ways that we should do something to restrict or reduce consumption of social media or alter the content of social media in some way. And those are policy recommendations that are uniform, right? And, Alcott at Genscow and other people have done field experiments where they pay people to deactivate their accounts and essentially consume less social media. And I think that's entirely appropriate. There's a context, but think about the other problem, the firm problem. So imagine you were a firm and you were trying to undertake randomized experimentation for the purpose of informing your firm policy to optimize your platform, not industry, not the industry at all, or not to evaluate social policies, but to optimize your own. And when you see the word optimize, that's like an infinity of counterfactuals, of course. But here, the problem with experimentation is it's usually small scale. So what does that mean? It just means that you'll never get the competitive response in your experiment. Or so the competitors won't know that you've changed your policy and you won't respond. And I think so that means that I think that calls even more to the general point that experimentation alone is not the answer to evaluating policies. A point that a number of people have made, and I don't think it's certainly not new to me. Right. So is there another role so in this context where we take as granted that to seriously do any kind of policy evaluation, either from the social planner perspective or the firm perspective, you need some sort of structure beyond just randomized variation, some sort of structural model. And, as Steve mentioned a number of times, that people love to take pot shots at these approaches by saying, oh, it involves arbitrary assumptions that are difficult to verify and so on. And I think that's actually a nice role for experimentation. And it doesn't have to be large scale experimentation. So, for example, if you take an assumption, and I'm thinking about a paper that I worked on with Uber data, and we were estimating labor supply of Uber drivers. And we made what I think some people would consider an heroic assumption that these drivers, that wages are exogenous to the driver's decisions at the driver city level. But there were also simultaneously small scale, true randomized experiments going on where wages were varied. And we showed that the essentially labor supply response from those experimental data agreed closely with our estimates based on passively observed data. So that's just an example where I think experimentation can be helpful in context or in conjunction with a structural approach. Okay, I want to say something about advertising. Many of my colleagues at business, have been in my business school and other business schools in other departments think that that's all marketing is about. And that's certainly not correct, but it's certainly a major point. And let me just just very, very shortly, right? We all think about what are the roles for advertising or what kinds of mechanisms make advertising work. And I think the first one suggested, I think in economics literature for sure, was it's conveying some kind of information about the product and so on. The other one, which I always thought was really a lovely paper, was the money burning type view, that it's a way to signal quality. And I always thought that was kind of a theoretical curiosity, that like, how would you ever test that theory? You can go through anecdotes at most, right? But actually, there's a nice paper by Sani and Nair in 2022 Review of Economic Studies where they did randomized assignment to sponsored or non-sponsored designated restaurant ads, I believe, on a restaurant review site. And they actually found evidence quite consistent with the signaling view. The third view of advertising is this persuasion style view that we're in these oligopolistic industries and we're trying to differentiate our products, and this is often implemented as a utility shifter point of view. So let me talk a little bit about those. I think most economists would generally think that more information is better than less. So roles number one and two, namely conveying information directly or signaling information, are okay in some normative sense, whatever that means. And I made it just obviously the people in the Bayesian persuasion literature don't seem to think that. They seem to be very fond of finding contrived situations in which provision of more information is actually worse. Um, but I think if you think about role number three there, the so-called pure persuasive view or differentiated view, I think there's an implicit view by many economists that that means that advertising is wasteful in some sense, that it incurs a deadweight loss, right? But if to be obviously very careful about that, because if you're allowing advertising to alter utility, you can't do the standard welfare type calculation, right? They're getting utility out of whether it's perceived or real, it's not relevant. Okay. What's the worst case for advertising, I guess, is what I would call vice goods advertising. And there, I think there might be a agreement by many people that we should not encourage people to consume these kinds of products. And the issue is how to efficiently discourage them. At least some people take that point of view. Two really nice papers here on vaping or e-cigarettes by Tuchman, who's a professor at Kellogg in Marketing Science 19, and another really nice paper, an 18 RE stud on advertising junk food or specifically potato chips. And they point out, which is a very, I think, important thing to do in policy conversations, is the unintended consequences, right? That if you ban advertising of these things, what's going to happen? People are going to substitute away. Those products are not going to be as attractive, and they're going to substitute away to things like regular or combustible cigarettes or Cheetos or Fritos or whatever it is, that other kind of junky, salty, oily stuff. And the Dubois paper says goes a little further, makes a very nice uh, uh, um, observation that what's going to happen also is because you don't have that advertising differentiation, you're going to get an incentive to lower prices. Equilibrium prices will be lower if you ban advertising. And that's going to encourage greater consumption. So you need to, if you want to actually do the right policy evaluation, you need to net out all that. Okay. So let's maybe return to this socially wasteful thing, right? And I think the poster child for this is the pharma industry, right? And in particular, Ariel actually mentioned this morning, right? That what do they do? Well, they advertise to consumers. That's DTC, direct to consumers, and they also pay an extraordinarily highly educated and expensive sales force to go and call upon doctors. And the view of this is conventionally that what they were doing is saying you should substitute drug X for drug Y when there's little actual difference between the drugs, right? There's a very nice paper by Shapiro, 2020 AEJ Micro, which he looks at the antidepressants category. And one should recognize, that one of the advantages of advertising, and here he's talking about direct-to-consumer advertising, is that it expands the category. It's not just that you substitute from Prozac to Proloft or whatever, Zoloft, whatever it is, right? But that you actually expand it. You get people more aware of the possibility of this therapy, right? And he did find data consistent with that, namely an increase in total antidepressants prescriptions. But he went even further and found a real effect. And that is to say, in reported time off work, which could be caused by depression, he actually was able to find a rather significant, both statistically and economically, effect on reduction in time off work. So I think it's a bit of a counterpoint to this view, I think, that by at least some economists seem to express, to me at least, that advertising is sort of a net bad thing or wasteful thing, at least certain types of it. Okay, finally, I want to talk about effectiveness of advertising, which you would think we in marketing would know the answer to that question. And it's a little embarrassing to say that because I think of the limitations of the data that had been used to estimate these effects, it's only been rather recently that we're getting our handle on this. Nice paper by Shapiro, Hitch, and Tuchman in 2021. What they did is they merged together two different sets of databases available from the Guild Center. One is on exposure to ads, the so-called Nielsen's rating data, and the other is retail sales. That's somewhat of a Herculean task. It's a little harder than you might think. And what they found when they put that together, is the elasticities that they estimate for exposure to ads are very low. And the ROI, so they did some back of the envelope calculations, and the rate of return on investment for those ads is negative for most of the brands they considered. Now, how did they do this? Why are their results so different? Partly they have a much more comprehensive database, many more products in the database. But the other is they're using exclusively within panel variation. And again, in homage to the spirit of Zvi Grillikis, he was one of the first people to point out that when you use these within estimators and you have an errors and variables problem, which they definitely do because the measurement is an ad stock variable that's difficult to get your hands on, that you may have, you're kind of maximizing the attenuation bias. But I encourage everyone to read the paper if you have. It's really great. By counterpoint, here's another paper also appearing in the marketing literature by Hartman and Clapper. And this is a paper called Super Bowl ads, I think, very simply. And it's about the effectiveness of beer ads on the Super Bowl. Now, at least during their data set periods, the exclusive advertiser for beer on the Super Bowl, and it was on every Super Bowl, was Anheuser-Busch, the makers of Bud Light and other awful beers. There is an institutional constraint. When you book ads on the Super Bowl, by the way, that's a national program, you have to book them before you actually know who's going to be in the Super Bowl. So you can't plan your ads based on who you expect to be in the Super Bowl and maybe run more beer ads in the year that the Pittsburgh Steelers are in the Super Bowl because Pittsburgh Steelers fans and others who in their nation are beer drinkers. So what they did is, again, is they used within variation. And in counterpoint to the Hitch et al. And Hitch, Tuchman, and Shapiro results, they find a very large ROI. Okay, so they're sort of at each other's extremes. On the other hand, this is one product, and these are not marginal ads, obviously, because they're on the Super Bowl and there's a lot of money involved. So I think that's actually sort of worth your time thinking about. And I want to talk a little bit about search. I know I only have like 10 minutes or 13 minutes or something. Um, uh, I've always been fascinated with the search literature, and yeah, I think the motivation is obvious. You know, the assumption of full information is unrealistic. Also, search is another way we can understand how certain types of advertising work. But I think the progress has been slow in this area for two reasons. One is lack of data. The data on what's actually needed to estimate a sequential search model is the sequence of alternatives searched, the order, the number, and their identity, and variation in that. And so that's very hard to get. I think we're being saved a little bit by the digital domain, where obviously, in some sense, we have browsing data, which is the search process. And there's an interesting other sources of data like geolocation data from phone locations. And there's a nice paper appearing in the QME by Yavorsky, Hanka, and Chen, appeared in the QME, excuse me, where they observe people visiting car dealers, and they know when they go into the geofenced area that's a car dealer, and they have the order and the identity, and they merge it against DMV records to get to sale. So that's fun stuff. Estimation difficulties. A lot of people try to fit these models by maximum likelihood. Maximum likelihood doesn't work very well, particularly simulated maximum likelihood, and certainly kernel smooth maximum likelihood does not work any well. If you try those methods, you're going to be confronted with many convergence failure messages. I'm not going to get into that. There are better ways around that problem. Um, the other thing I think people don't sort of recognize is how valuable search data is, namely, in some sense, on an observation by observation accounting, although that's hard to do with information, I understand, is that maybe equally valuable or more valuable than the purchase data, right? Because we're observing something about the ordering of people's preferences, not just the index of the maximum one. And it also may help us with the 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 nice thing about digital marketing data is we get to observe search, and the bad thing is the panels. If you think the panels in consumer products, packaged goods were short, they're very long compared to the digital panels. Okay. Now, finally, I want to ask a few. I don't want to be a little bit controversial here. Ask a few challenges and say, do we really need to model search? Okay. And what do I mean by that? In other words, obviously that depends on what we're trying to evaluate. That's obviously clear. But let's just think about, do we need to have a search model to understand the elasticity structure within a product category or an industry? And the answer, I think, to that is probably no. Okay. So what I want to have in mind here is consider you estimate a choice model with full heterogeneity, but no, and under the assumption of full information. Okay. In other words, you assume everyone knows everything. And I mean, just to make this easy, the case of price search, right? So people don't know the whole vector of prices. And then you estimate a search model with the same underlying preference model, but on a search model layered on top. So people don't know the full vector of prices. And then you have to allow for heterogeneity in search costs in order to make this even at all plausible empirically. Um, well, those two models, up to parametric differences, are going to give you very similar overall elasticity structures, because they're basically, one model is a reparameterization of the other at that level. Okay. Now, obviously, if you're going to change search costs through some policy change, or you're going to change the returns to price search by changing the stochastic price process that defines your pricing strategy, that will affect, then you need the full search model. So I didn't mean to say that for all things, but I think sometimes we get overly enamored of the modeling exercise. I think an important point is that in the modern digital retailer context, the the retailer has the power to dictate the search sequence by presenting the consumer with search alternatives for them or product rankings and all this sort of thing. And that's a source of market power. And there's a nice working paper by a fellow named Tai Lam at UCLA where he does this with Amazon browsing data. It shows that Amazon's ability to determine the search sequence or influence the search sequence is actually a source of market power. And there's another nice paper by Ursu on the power of rankings that I would recommend everyone take a look at. Okay, I'm almost done. Let me end by talking about somewhat older, but somewhat, I think, still very important topic, which is heterogeneity. And let me try to characterize the state of the art with heterogeneity from the perspective of someone in marketing. I'm not going to claim to have to summarize it in other areas, although I think they're similar. So what do we know? It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. All preference parameters are heterogeneous. A full distribution is required. Having your price coefficient be log normal and having other independent normal intercepts, brand intercepts, won't cut the mustard. Now, if you can't estimate a more flexible model, you'll never know. But in fact, when you do estimate these models, not only are these things, all of them quite heterogeneous, it's very rare to see anything we consider homogeneous, but they're all correlated or they're all related. And obviously, if you think about it for more than a few minutes, they can't be normally distributed. You think of brand intercept, some people like brand A, some people like brand B. It's going to be bimodal at the minimum, right? It's not just the price coefficient that might be more plausibly modeled by a skewed distribution like a log normal. And a lot of what we learned about that is by moving away from inefficient methods of estimation like method of moments or simulated MLE. That's how we learned this information. We're able to beat these models. Okay, but what's new in recent years? Well, you could ask yourself, maybe we're able to kill off this heterogeneity. So can we kill heterogeneity? What do I mean by that? I mean, and this is kind of related to the Heckman question. The Heckman question was, at least the way I think of it is, what are the conditions under which you can identify and tell the difference between state dependence and heterogeneity, right? You're going to need some sort of exogenous shock to move people to shift their initial states in order, right? Otherwise, heterogeneity, there'll be what looks like persistence that could be heterogeneity or state dependence. So he asked that question. I think the answer is in marketing, we have absolutely that kind of data because we have a tremendous price variability, which changed that. But you could also say, well, maybe what we are calling heterogeneity is essentially a masking of state dependence. So if you put state dependence in the model, heterogeneity survives. Both survive, actually, with flying colors. Now, Ariel mentioned some interesting things this morning about serially correlated unobservables. And I think he had in mind health status as a serially correlated unobservables in the context of purchases of health insurance, right? And he said, and I think made the point that what we need to do is control for enough stuff so that does not influence kappa, I think he called it, which is the true state dependence, or what he's calling inattention. In our context, we don't health status, I think, is a wonderful example of that, such a serially correlated unobservable. In our data, it's probably something like advertising that we don't observe, right? The problem, though, is advertising's power spectrum is centered at low frequencies relative to the power spectrum of prices. So essentially, most of the variation of prices comes at high frequency, right? So that serially correlated observable is not going to affect in any material way our estimates of state dependence. But I also throw a question back to Ariel like, well, which would you really need to do? Do you really, if you wanted to evaluate changes in health insurance pricing, like co-payments or something like that, would you really need to know the deep parameter? Unless you think those changes are going to alter the process, the external process by which people get sick, then you don't actually need to know it. And if you do estimate it, you've got to then verse engineer by integrating over those processes. So I'm not sure you actually need to know that deep parameter unless you make the assumption that these policy changes are going to influence that process. And the same thing is true of advertising as well. Okay. All right. So that's a little comment. I just want to link to other talks. Um, and the other question you might say is, does heterogeneity survive search? In other words, if you properly model search and add it to a model that it has some degree of heterogeneity in it, is that going to cut and heterogeneity, the size of heterogeneity down to some extent? Nice paper, Morozov and Seiler, 2023, Marking Science, where they did exactly that. They find heterogeneity is still there. It hasn't died in spite of their efforts to kill it. But it's much smaller. It's like on the order of a half to a third size. But on the other hand, their model of search has heterogeneous product-specific search costs. And I think there you're sort of blurring the distinction between preferences and search. So I think I just conclude that the reports of the death of heterogeneity are greatly exaggerated. Apologies to Mark Twain. Then finally, I just want to say, uh, and it's been a really encouraging to me to see the tremendous amount of high quality work that's being done in marketing, particularly recently. And I like to say I think it's been a great privilege to be a small part of the melding of economics and marketing over the last 25 years. And so I don't think I'm being presumptuous if I say to the audience, now it's your turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And speaking of your turn, we'll take question. Yes, in the back. And we will need to use a microphone.
Yeah, because I can't hear as well.
We'll run up one up to you. Just a sec.
So I wanted to ask a question that actually ties a little bit back to Steve's last slide about the future of I/O. And so, I think which is how, it's actually a question for Steve, which is how should we evaluate the social contribution of poorly identified structural models? Right. And I think Peter's talk, Peter, I very much share your view about the value of experimentation. And let me share that my perspective is influenced very much by the last few years working for a big e-commerce platform in Europe. And I guess my question to you, Peter, is so if we're thinking about the future of I/O, I think I/O is a set of valuable methods, not only about economic models, but identification arguments. And can we bring experimentation to really help augment the reliability of the estimates coming out of there? And what I see, but I'm wondering if you see the same, and that's the question, is I see that firms now have experimentation platforms. You mentioned Facebook, but there are many firms that now have experimentation platforms. And there's a third-party ecosystem building these capabilities that are seeking to partner with smaller firms. Is that where you see the future of experimentation coming into I/O and marketing research, or do you have another path in mind?
Is that question directed to me or Steve? I don't
You.
want.
Where's the experimentation going to come from?
Yes, well, obviously, those of us in academia are at a disadvantage, right? We have to go out and beg people to do experiments for us, right? And so I think what you're saying is you'll get a lot of this in the industry going on for their own purposes. Now, let me just say that execution of experiments in industry can be really problematic. And in particular, Facebook's algorithms have actually distorted the experimental treatments and blurred the distinction between treatments and controls. So I think it's important to have somewhat of a level of rigor when you are evaluating that kind of activity. But absolutely, I think that you're right, that ultimately, if we want to do field experiments, we either have to be as rich as Matt Genskow, and do it with consumers, or we have to go and beg firms. And I think that's all the more reason. And one of the reasons that I've been my whole career in a business school is to hopefully encourage and exploit that opportunity.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. That's the time for the session.